Hey everyone, before the sermon begins, I want to tell you about a free resource that I'm really excited about. At Creekside, it's our goal to experience and express God's glory, and one of the ways that we aim to do that is through personal sanctification, which is just a fancy way of saying we want to grow in our relationships with God. We know that that can be especially difficult during the Christmas season, and so this year we produced a devotional booklet that's a companion to the series of sermons we're doing, one of those sermons you're about to watch. This booklet has 150 to 200 word daily reflections, writings in it, and I do believe that it will help everyone who will read them focus on the birth of Jesus and the glory of God. You can get this booklet totally free. If you want a hard copy, all you have to do is visit one of our services during the month of December. But if you're not able to do that, or you're not ready to do that, then you can get an electronic version by going to wilsonville.church/Gloria booklet. I really do believe this booklet can help you focus on Jesus' birth and the glory of God this year, this December, this Christmas season. And so again, I hope that you'll get one by visiting one of our services or going to wilsonville.church/Gloria booklet. I'm glad you chose to listen to this sermon. I really do hope it will help you to learn and live more fully for the glory of God. Merry Christmas.
Okay, hey guys, I'm about to tell you a story about a guy named Jesus. He was a human, want you to know that. But I also want you to know that this human was God. Now, if you hadn't grown up in America where Christendom exists, where we have Christianity kind of just driving culture for most of our human history. That's what that means. Like, it's driven our culture, right? Like, there's churches all around us, even out here in the Northwest. I mean, we drive by churches on an average drive. Much of our very Constitution, our Constitution and what we're founded on is driven by some biblical ideas and things like that. Some of the early American people were Christians. Most of them probably were Christians. It's like a part of us, right? So we just become immune to the idea. But if you were the first person ever to read, hey, here's what I want you to know about Jesus. He was God in human form. God came to be with people. God became a person. You're like, really? Is that science fiction? Is that real? I should explore that more. Is that an actual thing? Is there any proof of that? I think that would be a logical question. What's the proof? John, hey, why do you say that? What could lead you to that belief? But I would guess that if we were just reading that for the first time, that our response would not be to think about Christianity the way that we always do. We'd be like, sure, yeah, I'm a Christian, or, oh, I got to follow all these rules, or I should really pray because I need more money. And that would be like the only expression. That's a good thing to do maybe, but like the only expression. And so what I want, the first thing is just think about it. Like, God became a napkin. It's almost as ridiculous of a statement because we're a creation just like a napkin, right? We're a better creation. We're a more important creation. We're the creation that has the likeness and image of God built within us, but we're still a creation. So I want you to just think about the weight of that. And then John says this other incredible thing that's just as powerful. John 1:14 continues, we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father. Jesus is glorious. And I just think about this now. Just consider this for a second. Do you have any friend in your life that you would call glorious? Nobody, right? Like, that's not a normal description of a person. You might say, I got a really cool friend, or I got a friend that's so nice, like they're just so great. And you might have a friend that's super helpful. You might have a friend that's super awesome. You might have a friend even that's super good looking, or super strong, or super athletic. And this is how we describe people. And John is writing the story of his friend's life. And he says, this is God in human form. We would never say that about anybody we know. We might say this is Satan in human form about some people we know, but we'd never say God. This is God in human form. And guess how I want you to know him? As glorious, because I have seen his glory. You wouldn't say that about anybody that you know. Like, oh, I've seen how glorious they are. No, that's not a description that we use of people. And this is how he describes a guy that he walked around with for a few years doing ministry. We have seen his glory. It's interesting. I didn't even know this until I was studying for this sermon. But in John 12:41, it says, Isaiah said this because he saw Jesus' glory and spoke about him. Isaiah lived thousands of years before Jesus, which points to the fact that Jesus is God in human form. But I just thought that was an interesting verse that's important. But I want you to think about this, because we can look at the Bible and go, oh, the Bible, whatever. But this is a man who walked with Jesus, who talked with Jesus, who hung out with Jesus, who was friends with Jesus, saying, this is God in human form, and I have seen his glory. It's a pretty big deal. And what's so fascinating is when you read the book of John, you would expect, if you knew nothing about Christianity, if you had not heard this story before, you would expect all of these crazy, miraculous, glowing, bright events from Jesus' life. But he doesn't tell the story quite that way. He shows a bunch of signs and some miracles that show that Jesus is glorious. In fact, at the first sign, this is what John records for us about Jesus turning water into wine. He says, what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. This word translated glory, it's a word that's we've talked about, right? But it translates an Old Testament word, which is kabod, and this word is used for the manifestation of God's disclosure. I like that. It was a new way. I'm seeing all these new ways to define glory, which I said at the beginning of this series is a hard word to define. It's an easier word to see, much like the word beautiful. But I'm seeing all these new ways, and I really liked that. I mean, just the manifestation of God's self-disclosure. We saw the same thing in Hebrews 1:1-3 last week, where that author said, like, hey, look, Jesus is the radiance of God's glory. Now John says, we've seen it. I've seen it. I hung out with the guy and I saw how glorious he is. And in John's story, he reveals to us the gloriousness, the difference of Jesus, how much better Jesus is than a normal human, a human who isn't God, in a variety of ways. And just a few of those, I mean, through Jesus' moral perfection, we see that Jesus is perfect morally. He never makes a bad decision. He always does the right thing. He's always obedient to the Father that is in heaven, always 100% of the time while he walked the earth. We see that he's an incredible teacher. And Matt, after next week, I'm preaching one more time on Christmas Eve, and then Matt's going to do a 3-week series on how Jesus is the greatest storyteller ever. Matt's going to show us some of those stories, but we see it in his teaching. And the people are like, who is this guy? Where does he get his authority to speak in this way? Because what they were used to was people who had people ahead of them who had taught them, and people ahead of them who had taught them, and it trickled down. And so they taught on the authority of some guy that taught them. And Jesus shows up and he teaches with the authority of God. Because as John would reveal, he is God. And then we see it through his miracles and his signs. He heals people, he feeds people. It's incredible to read about the life of Jesus when you're actually thinking about what somebody is saying about the life of Jesus, right? Not just going, well, I've heard before that he fed 5,000 with a couple of loaves of bread and a few fish. But to be like, a man fed 5,000 men plus women and children with just a few fish and a little bit of bread. I mean, that's incredible, right? And then there's this story that John reveals to us and the other gospel writers reveal to us called the Transfiguration that we talked about last week, where maybe the author of this book is up on a mountain with them, and Jesus, humanity is peeled back in some way for a minute, and they see Jesus shining brightly. They see the glory of Jesus. Now, all that's incredible. But John here does something that I think is so valuable. Because at the beginning of his book, he's saying, look, this is God in human form. We have seen his glory. And now he connects something to the glory of Jesus it's kind of like a bait and switch. You'd expect, like bright shining lights or fire or smoke, as we see often in the Old Testament. But this is what John connects it to in the last part of this verse. I'll read it all together. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. The language of this in Greek, which is what the New Testament is written to, connects the glory and the full of grace and truth. And so what John is saying is like, hey, we've seen the glory of Jesus. And let me tell you, one of the ways we've seen it is in how gracious he is and how perfectly he represents the truth. D.A. Carson says, the glory of God manifest in the incarnate Word was full of grace and truth. Now, there's a couple of different options on what John is connecting this to, and frankly, he might just be saying it because he just experienced the grace of Jesus and the truth of Jesus. But I think that he points back in these two words to something that took place in the Old Testament, something we've already read about in this series, talking about the glory of God. In Exodus 33, 18 and 19, there's this conversation that I mentioned a couple weeks ago between Moses and God. And there it says, Moses said, now show me your glory. He's talking to God. And the Lord said, I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. As I said last week, part of the glory of God, and we don't think about this if we think about glory at all, but part of the glory of God is plain and simply the goodness of God. And so John says, look, I've seen his glory. And I think part of what he's saying is I've seen how just good Jesus is. But then this other part is just so interesting because in kind of that same conversation between Moses and God, Moses says, show me your glory. God says, I'll show you my goodness. And then later, God passes in front of Moses. And here's what we read in Exodus 34, 5 and 7, and 5 through 7. I think it's right up the alley at least of what John's saying, and I think it's actually what the book of John is trying to connect to. In Exodus 34, 5 through 7, then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, notice this, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Notice those two words that connect so clearly, right? I mean, that first word, love, is this Old Testament word that's the best word in the Old Testament. It's a Hebrew word, hesed, and hesed is a word that translates like a lot of the good things that you read in the Old Testament. So if you're like, oh, I really like that God is loving, it might be the word hesed, or loving kindness, it's often translated. Or covenant love is how people understand it. And what it is basically is it's this love and graciousness, this kindness of God that is based on the promises that God has made and not based on human merit or what the people had done to deserve it. It's much like the idea of grace that we read about in the New Testament. And so Moses looks at God and God passes in front of him, and immediately we see that God loves people, not because of what people have done, but because of who God is in his very nature, rich in love and abounding with grace. And then we see that God is faithful. And in the book of John, truth is a really important concept, a fairly kind of confusing concept. I mean, at one point, Jesus declares, I am the way, the truth, and the life. It's really interesting. What does it mean to be the truth? I mean, what is that right there? And then in John 18, 37 through 38, it's at the very end of Jesus' life, and he's with this guy named Pilate, and Pilate has his fate in his hands, and Jesus brings up the topic of truth, and he says this, everyone on the side of truth listens to me, and then Pilate says, what is truth? It's this really profound moment, and John's already kind of shown us Jesus is the truth. But the part I think that Jesus brings out, or John is bringing out here about Jesus, is not kind of this broad idea of truth, but something more narrow that's wrapped up in it, and that is that Jesus is perfectly faithful, and what he shows to us is the perfect faithfulness of God to humankind. God created us. God wanted a relationship with us. God made a bunch of promises that says, look, I'm going to give you a way to remove your sin and to be in relationship with me and to spend eternity with me. And then Jesus came. And in Jesus, John saw the gloriousness of God in part by seeing how gracious and wonderful and loving and faithful God is to people. I think it's interesting that people are searching for something they can hold on to, right? I mean, just look around at our culture, just get on social media, and everybody wants something that they can cling to because what we take as truth is shifting so fast, right? I mean, all around us it's shifting, and what people believe today will be different tomorrow. And John, a couple thousand years ago, says, you want something faithful? Well, I've seen something faithful. I saw Jesus. I saw God in human form. Now look, this is what we just need to get in our heads. Like, Jesus is God in human form. He's perfectly glorious because of that. And one of the ways that it was seen is through his incredible grace and truth. And I think about this. I think about grace and how incredible it really is. And if you've experienced it, if you know the grace of God in your life, then you know how attractive it is. You know how glorious it is. And for me, let me just tell you why I'm on this stage today, why I am a pastor of a church, why I try to be a dad that is intentional, why I sometimes am a halfway good husband, why I live a life that matters at all. It's because I saw the gloriousness of Jesus' grace. And I grew up in a Christian home. I grew up believing in Jesus and believing, and I should have told you this part of the story, but we think that grace is culminated in Jesus dying for the sins of people and then rising again. Let me step back and say, so look, you've done wrong things, I've done wrong things, we've done bad things, evil things. And God looked down from heaven, Jesus looked down from heaven, and he said, wow, they're stuck in that sin. And so Jesus came from heaven to earth. He was born of a virgin. He lived a perfect life, morally speaking. And then he died at the end of it, the most brutal death the world has ever known. And that wasn't just because it was a worse physical death than other people have experienced. It's because it was a worse spiritual death, whereas he hung on a cross. All of our sins hung upon his shoulders. In fact, it was like he was suffering all of hell for all of us. And so Jesus did that, and then he rose again 3 days later. And so when I was 17, I knew all that. I believed all that. I grasped all that. It was like a part of my life. I went to church, but it didn't mean that much to me. And then there was somebody in my life that I just felt like I needed to tell them some of the things I had done wrong. And I went to that person and I told them, and that didn't matter at all. But that night I got home, and what happened is I realized how wretched of a person I can be. And then all of a sudden, I just thought about Jesus dying for all of it. Every lie and every indiscretion and every mean word and every lustful thought and every jerky thing I had ever done. I thought about the fact that as Jesus hung on a cross, he was paying for all of that. And then the gloriousness of God showed up in that room, and I spent hours crying because I had seen how gracious and true God was in the person of Jesus. And it changed everything about me. And I have not been perfect or lived up to the standard that I want to live up to after that, but I have never been the same. And I think when we think about Jesus, it's so easy to just be like, I've heard it before. But when John opens this gospel and says, look, when Jesus came, let me tell you what came. First, God came. Second, the glory of God came. And third, the grace and truth of God came. What we see in that opening prologue to his incredible gospel story, that the one that John writes, is we see that God is glorious in his grace. And what we really see is that if we want to think about how glorious God is, then we must think about the gospel story, the story of Jesus' birth and life and death and resurrection. And I'm telling you, I've said in this series that when we experience the glory of God in the Christmas story, we should express it. And when we view Jesus wrongly, then we're going to glorify God lightly. And here's what you need to understand, that if you're really going to glorify God and express his glory, then you must understand the gloriousness of the gospel. I would say it this way: God's glory is experienced in God's grace, which is explicit in God's gospel. And so this Christmas, I know it's easy just to think about the birth of Jesus, but you can't separate the birth of Jesus from the fact that that birth was God coming to earth, and he came to earth to suffer and die on your behalf. And you cannot separate the gloriousness of the God we serve or the Son from the gloriousness of the entire gospel. That Jesus would come and he'd die for our sins, and he would rise again so that we might spend eternity in heaven. And so as you spend the next week and a couple days thinking about Christmas, I want you to remember that God's glory is experienced in God's grace, which is explicit in God's gospel. And I want you not to take this Christianity thing lightly, but to feel the weight of it, the weight of God's glory coming to earth in the person of Jesus and offering us his perfect, amazing grace. I want to pray that you'll do that. Pray with me. Lord, I'm as guilty as anybody else at just thinking about how you became a napkin and acting like it's no big deal. But I pray, God, that we, all of us who are here this morning, those who would listen online, God, I pray that would change, God, that we would not express Christianity in this really cheap way. Because we would not think of Christianity in a really cheap way, but we would think about the weight of God, you becoming a person. And then not only you becoming a person, but you, God, then giving up your life for us who are people. Lord, I just don't want us to go through, especially the Christmas season, but our lives, treating the story of your gospel like it's unimportant or unvaluable or not cool. And so I pray that you change us, Lord, if that's us. I pray, God, for any non-Christians who are here, who will listen online later, God, the people who have not given their lives to you, I pray, God, that they would give their lives to you. But if they won't, I pray that it would at least consider what John is telling us about you. That you, Jesus, are God in human form, and that you, Jesus, are the gloriousness of God because of your incredible grace. And God, at least cause them to reject it. But I pray they would not dismiss it without thinking about it. And I ultimately pray they would give their lives to you because of it. Jesus, thank you for coming to earth. Thank you for dying for us. Thank you for the gloriousness of your grace and your gospel. I pray these things in your holy name. Amen.